Hey guys, it's Mr. B here. So today I've got a 2008 Infinity M35X. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to teach you guys how to check your vehicle's fluid levels. So of course it's going to be on this vehicle, but it's very similar to a lot of other vehicles on the road today. So the location of the fluids might be a little bit different, obviously compared to other vehicles, but I wanted to take the time to make a video on just a generic fluids check, right? So we're going to check the oil, the coolant, the power steering fluid, the transmission fluid. This vehicle is also all-wheel drive, so it has transfer case fluid and rear differential fluid. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with the engine oil. So if you have a vehicle that has higher mileage, a lot of times the engine will burn a little bit of oil. Newer engines are known to burn oil from the factory even, just because of the way they've designed their rings and whatnot. So there are quite a few manufacturers that have come out and said it's normal for their engines to burn about 1 quart of oil every 1,000 to 3,000 miles. So you want to make sure that you're keeping up with checking your engine oil, making sure it's full, especially on a vehicle over 100,000 miles. So on this particular vehicle, our engine oil dipstick tube is right here. It's yellow. It even says engine oil right on it. And then this cap right here with our oil bottle, that is the cap where we would top off our oil. So if you wanted to add more oil to the engine, if it was low, you just twist that off. Obviously put it back on when you're done. And then to check the engine oil on this car, first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and remove the dipstick. And I'm just going to wipe it off with a rag. Okay, so I'm going to wipe it clean. Just like that. And then obviously got to find where it goes. Way down in there, kind of tricky to get to. So I'm going to push this all the way back in. I'm going to go ahead and push that dipstick back in. I'm going to push it down all the way. And I'm going to pull it back out. Okay. All right, so looking at this dipstick, get it to where we can see it better. It is a little bit low. Okay, luckily it's still on the stick, which is good. We want it to be like that. It's where the oil is on the stick. You can see I'll flip it around. You can see the L for low and the H for high, those hash marks there. That's your safe range. Okay, so the oil is in the safe range. It still looks pretty clean. It's not super discolored, or it doesn't have any chunks in it. Doesn't seem like it has any moisture in it. On older vehicles, typically you would want to smell it too to see if it smells like gas. If the vehicle is hard to start, it might start getting a little bit of gas slipping past the rings and getting into the oil. But overall, I would say the oil level on this and the condition of the oil is pretty good. So yeah, it's still in the safe mark. I am going to do an oil change on this vehicle, so I will have another video for that as well if you want to check that out. But if it wasn't due for an oil change, I would go ahead and top it off. You want to make sure you find the right oil for your vehicle. If you are going to change the oil or top off the oil, you want to make sure that you find the right oil for your vehicle. There's a whole bunch of different weights out there. There's 0W20, 5W30, 10W30. Do your research. Make sure you're finding the right stuff so that when you do top off your oil, you're using the right oil. Sometimes it says it right up on the cap. A lot of times you just have to go to the parts store and tell them what vehicle you have, and they'll find you the right stuff. Or of course, look it up in your owner's manual or the service manual if you have access to that as well. Okay, so the oil level is a little low on this car. I would definitely top it off if I wasn't doing an oil change and I had another, 1, 2, 3,000 miles left to go, on that oil change. So your coolant. Okay, so if you want to check your coolant, some vehicles, this one has it, Some vehicles still have a silver radiator cap right on the radiator. So your radiator right here is what houses a good amount of your coolant or antifreeze. That is what cools off the engine while it's running. Without antifreeze or coolant in the engine or in the radiator, your engine will overheat. It'll cause damage basically immediately. And so the one thing with checking coolant is you want to make sure that you never open it when it's hot. Okay, this radiator cap. Some vehicles don't have the cap right on the radiator anymore. They have it on the reservoir. This coolant reservoir is not pressurized, so I can open up that cap at any time and it'll be just fine. But this cap here is the one you really want to be careful of. So I've let this vehicle sit for a while. It's cooled down for the most part. It is still a little warm to the touch, so I'm just going to be careful with it. I'm going to go ahead and take a rag, put it over top of the cap, and slowly open the cap because I know that it's still a little warm, so I don't want it to come spewing up at my face. And I didn't even have to really worry about it. So sometimes these caps will leak. There's a rubber seal on them that keeps the coolant from leaking out the top. So sometimes if you have a coolant leak, really all you have to do is replace that cap. Not all the time, but sometimes that's all it is. So you want to make sure your coolant's full in the radiator, which obviously this vehicle is full on coolant, which is good. In the reservoir, there is a minimum line and a maximum line. It's just above that maximum line, which is okay. You don't want to overfill this too much to where it's all the way up to the top, because then as the engine warms up and the coolant expands a bit, it will start overfilling and overflowing out of that reservoir. So you never want to overfill the reservoir for that reason. If you can't see those marks, you can also remove the cap for the reservoir and look down in there if you needed to. But as far as the coolant goes, I mean, it's not chunky, it's not discolored, it looks good, it's full. The one thing you do want to do from time to time is check the freeze point of your coolant or your antifreeze, because this stuff is mixed with water. Okay, so obviously we all know that water freezes in the wintertime when it gets below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And this tester will test for the freeze point. Depending on where you live, you might need the 50-50 mixture, 50% water, 50% antifreeze, to get to the negative 35 degree mark to where it will freeze there. Now, this is not including wind chill. This is ambient air temp. If your ambient air temperature gets below negative 35, which in the States is not super common, but maybe could happen depending on where you're at. You might have to add a little bit more antifreeze, like a 60%, 40% water, mixture, that type of thing. But for the most part, that negative 35 degree mark is where you want it. So in order to test it, I'm going to go ahead and stick this hose down obviously in the coolant. Push on this ball right here. I'm going to push on this ball. Probably should have done that first. I'm going to push on this ball as much as I can. And then I'm going to suck up as much coolant as I can into my tester. There we go. You want to make sure you fill it full, okay? You want the fluid level to be right at that range or a little bit above. And this orange dial right here, when you level it out, that orange dial will tell you what your freeze point is. So right now it's pointing towards negative 45. So we're a little heavy on the antifreeze, which is fine, right? You don't want pure antifreeze in the system. It will start to sludge up and cause problems when it gets colder. You do want 50% water, 50% antifreeze, and this is going to test for that. Now, if my freeze point was way down here at negative 10, if that orange dial was pointing towards negative 10, that's a problem, depending on where you live, at least where we're from, right, where I'm from. It gets below negative 10. So if your antifreeze freezes because there's too much water, you can actually crack your engine block. The radiator could crack, the engine block could crack. You could literally ruin your engine simply because you have too much water in your radiator and circulating through your engine block and not enough antifreeze. So it's very important to check that. Make sure it's at the right level and obviously the right freeze point. If you had too much water, you could drain out a little bit of coolant, down at the bottom of the radiator, and then add pure antifreeze to help, dilute that mixture with more antifreeze if you needed to. This vehicle doesn't need it, which is good, but you always want to make sure you check that, especially if you just bought the vehicle, because you don't know what's been done to the vehicle before. So I've got a little bit of coolant here overflowing. I don't want to make a huge mess, so I'm going to save that and put it in that reservoir. When you go to put that cap back on, you want to make sure that the cap is nice and tight. So I'm going to go ahead and twist this to the right until it stops. Okay, if I leave it loose, it's going to leak, right? So twist it till it stops. Make sure it's on there nice and snug. It's not coming off. That cap's back on. Good to go. Okay, so my coolant reservoir, of course I dropped it. There's a cap right there. I can just take the coolant, dump it right back in. And as the engine runs and warms up and then cools down, the coolant does circulate back and forth between the radiator and the reservoir. It's just a natural thing. That's why the reservoir is there. So I'm going to go ahead and just put the cap back on now that I know that the fluid level is good for the coolant. This vehicle does have hydraulic power steering, so we do have power steering fluid, which is in this reservoir right here. If you look at the top of the cap, it even says what type of fluid to use. So this one says to use Dexron type ATF. So that is actually automatic transmission fluid, not power steering fluid. There are some vehicles that do take automatic transmission fluid for the power steering fluid. It's a normal thing. Some manufacturers use ATF for their power steering fluid. Some just use generic power steering fluid. They're similar, but not quite the same. So you want to make sure you're using the right power steering fluid. And of course, the right transmission fluid. We'll get to that later. But for this vehicle, it does have a nice little level line there. It's got a cold mark for min and max. So it's actually a little bit below that minimum mark. There could be a slow leak somewhere in one of our hoses. I'll go ahead and make sure that I top that off before I'm done, working on this vehicle. If you wanted to top it off or needed to top it off, you just pop the cap loose. Get yourself a funnel, pour the right fluid in there to top that off if needed, okay? And of course, make sure the cap goes back on nice and snug. Sometimes they're a little tricky. There we go. Okay, so it just kind of spins around on there, but that's on. It's not coming loose, so make sure that cap goes back on when you're done. This vehicle, of course, has brake fluid. Sometimes it's kind of hard to find it if it's all covered up with plastic. Luckily on this vehicle, it's labeled, right? So our brake fluid is right underneath this plastic panel. So you just push on those tabs, pop that plastic piece off, and then boom, right down in there, there's your master cylinder right there and your brake fluid reservoir right there. Of course, we got lucky and this cap does say what fluid to use. .3. Okay, so I would want to use .3 or .4 brake fluid. .3 and .4 brake fluid are compatible with each other. So technically .3 is the fluid, but you could also put in .4. Do not put in .5. It's a different base. It's a silicon base. If you put .5 in here, it will wreak havoc on your braking system. The two fluids just don't mix. So do not use .5 when the specification is .3 or .4. .3 and .4 do mix together. You can use them compatibly. They're compatible with each other, but .5 does not mix with either one of those. So just take note of that. And then of course we do have a minimum and a maximum. We're right at that maximum mark. So our brake fluid is right where it needs to be. The brake fluid gets pushed through the brake lines to allow the brakes to, you know, stop the vehicles. It kind of seems important. If you ran low on brake fluid, it's because you have a leak, right? So you'd have to find that leak and fix it if you want to be able to drive this vehicle safely down the road. I don't have to worry too much about it right now because I've got a nice firm brake pedal on this vehicle and our fluid level is good. But it is something that you want to check periodically just to make sure that you're not low on brake fluid. Or, of course, if you have a spongy pedal, you're going to want to check your brake fluid and maybe top it off just to get it safely to a shop or to your house to repair it if needed. So we've checked the brake fluid, we've checked the coolant, we've checked the oil, we've checked the power steering fluid. This vehicle, of course, has windshield washer fluid. Usually there's a cap right on top of the reservoir to label it, and it kind of looks like fluid squirting up at a windshield. Obviously, at some point, somebody removed this plastic clip, never put it back on, never put the cap back on. But that reservoir is supposed to be for the windshield washer fluid. That's one of those fluids that just runs out as you use it, and then you're going to want to top that off when it goes low. If you live in an area where temperatures get below freezing, your windshield washer fluid, you're going to want to make sure that you use the winter blend, which is good to, I think, -20 or -30 maybe, even if you buy the right stuff. So that way it doesn't freeze inside the tank. Now, for this vehicle, to check the transmission fluid, we did get lucky. There is a dipstick. Some vehicles, newer vehicles, do not have a dipstick for the transmission. There's a plug on the side of the case of the trans where you have to remove the plug from underneath to get to it, to check the fluid level. 9.9 times out of 10, the engine does have to be running to check the transmission fluid, to circulate that fluid through the transmission, through the torque converter, because the torque converter is what houses most of the transmission fluid. And the engine has to be running for there to be a bunch of fluid in the torque converter. So anyways, long story short, I am going to go ahead and start the engine on this vehicle once I'm ready to check the transmission fluid properly. If you do not have the engine running while checking transmission fluid, then you're not going to be checking it properly. You're going to underfill it, and then you're going to have issues with shifting and a whole bunch of other stuff. So on this vehicle, we do have a dipstick, so we got lucky. It's way up here in the back. Okay, so let me get this somewhere where the light's shining on it. That's my dipstick right there. I'm gonna have to remove that bolt. It's just a 10mm bolt. I'm gonna go ahead and work on getting that out. And then we'll be able to check the transmission fluid on this vehicle. There's my bolt. And there's my dipstick. Okay. So just like engine oil, the transmission on this vehicle also has a dipstick. So I'm going to pull that out. And I'm going to go ahead and take my rag and just wipe it off. Okay, just like that. And I'm going to go ahead and push this in just a little bit, but not all the way. Because like I said, I have to have the engine running to properly check the transmission fluid on this vehicle. So I'm gonna go ahead and get the engine started. The other thing too is you want to make sure it's on a level surface. I do have the vehicle jacked up right now, but I've got it jacked up pretty evenly to where all 4 jack stands are underneath. If I only had one axle jacked up, that could cause issues because now it would be on an incline. So you want to make sure the vehicle's somewhat level. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfectly level, but you want to make sure that it's somewhat level to where when you check the fluid level for the transmission or even the engine oil, that you're on a somewhat level surface, because if you're on an incline, then it's going to change your readings on your dipstick because the fluid level is going to be off. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push this dipstick all the way down. And then pull it all the way back out. Okay, just like that. And then just like my engine oil, we're gonna check the fluid level And let's see. So there's a hot range and a cold range. Or, well, usually. This dipstick just has a hot range. So if I wanted to really check this properly, I would have to drive the vehicle until the engine and the transmission were warmed up, because my hot range is between those two hash marks right there. So obviously my fluid level is a little low because I haven't driven the vehicle to warm up the transmission. So at the very least, I wanted to use this as an example of how to check the fluid level with a dipstick. And it might be that the transmission fluid on this car is a little low. So what I'll do before I'm done is, before I'm done working on the vehicle, is I'll take it for a test drive and then just make sure that transmission fluid is within those hash marks, within that range, to know that the fluid level is where it needs to be. Because right now it is, of course, a little low, but it's possible that that's just the cold range and they didn't mark it on the dipstick. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this back in, and then I'm gonna show you guys from underneath how to check the transfer case fluid and the differential fluid on this vehicle. And of course, I'm gonna shut off the engine once I get to that point. All right, so I'm underneath the vehicle, and the next fluid I'm going to show you guys how to check is the transfer case fluid. So this vehicle is all-wheel drive. We've got a drive shaft going to the front with a front differential over there, and then we've got this is the transmission right here. So that's your transmission pan. Behind that is your transfer case. So of course the transfer case has its own fluid. The fill plug and the check plug is right up in here. Okay, so I have to remove that plug to check the fluid level on this transfer case. I'm gonna go ahead and use a 10mm Allen key. This one's like a socket where I can use my ratchet. Sometimes those plugs get rusty and you have to use a hammer and tap on the end of it a little bit to get that to go into the slot there. Hopefully this one goes right in. It's kind of stuck, so I'm gonna go ahead and tap on it with a hammer and get that to go in. This trick seems to help and prevent the possibility of stripping out the plug, because if that plug strips out in there, you're SOL. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn this to the left, try and get it to come loose, and see what happens from there. Okay, so now that I got it cracked loose, I'm just gonna go ahead and twist that out of there. And with this transfer case fluid, you don't have to have the engine running. Really all you gotta do is just take the plug out. And if fluid starts pouring out that hole, you know that it's full. If you can feel it by putting your finger in there, then, I mean, that can kind of act as like a dipstick, which is fine. So there is a little bit of fluid dripping out of there. I'm just gonna take my finger, if I can reach up in there. I'm just gonna take my finger and put it in that hole and see if I can feel any fluid. Your pinky works just fine. So I do have a ton of fluid coming off the end of my pinky there. And there's of course now fluid running out of there. So that fluid level in that transfer case is full. because when I dip my finger in there, there's plenty of fluid down in there, so it's full. When you fill these up, you want fluid to be pouring out that hole, and then put the plug in, so that way you know that there's plenty of fluid in there and it's not going to run low unless, of course, there's a leak, right? So if you see a seal leaking somewhere or a gasket leaking somewhere, you're going to want to repair that as soon as possible. And sometimes you just don't have the time, money, or ability to do that, and you might just have to top off the fluid. If you had to top off the fluid for this, I would recommend getting a fluid transfer pump. They are very, very, very handy for these tight situations where you can't really get up in there. You can buy the handheld ones, or you can even get fancy and buy one that goes in the end of a drill, because getting a funnel up in here is nearly impossible. So if you're going to top off this fluid, I would recommend getting a fluid transfer pump. So I'm just going to go ahead and retighten this plug. You don't have to go super tight, just give it a good snug so it's tight and it won't leak, and then you're done. Okay, so that's how you check your transfer case fluid. Excuse me. Make sure I get my tool back. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how to check the front and rear differentials. All right, so I'm underneath the front of the vehicle now, and this vehicle does have a front differential with its own fluid. So that plug there is the drain plug, and that plug is the check and fill plug. So just like the transfer case, I'm going to remove that plug, get that out of there, and check the fluid level just like I did on the transfer case. So again, I'm going to get my Allen key, stick it up in there, and then get my ratchet. Oh, I'm going to have to hammer that. Yep, I'm going to hit that with a hammer to get it on further. Okay, so now that that's on, I'm gonna go ahead and stick my ratchet on the end of here and try and crack that loose. Perfect. There it goes. All right. So now I'm gonna take that plug out, and if fluid starts pouring out, then we know we're good. And it's not. So I'm gonna go ahead and use my pinky as a dipstick. Ooh, you can smell it too. So these differentials typically take gear lube, and gear lube smells, well, not good. And of course, trying to get anything up in there doesn't really work. My finger might fit and it might not. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and use a pick as my dipstick. All right, so for those hard to reach places to check the fluid on these differentials, a pick comes in handy. If you didn't have a pick, you could technically use just an old piece of wire and bend it at a 90-degree angle to get up in there. You know, if you had a smaller pick, that might work as well. So I'll push that in there, see what we get. For fluid on, oh yeah, look at that. Okay, so we've got drips coming off of that pick. So that tells me right there that the fluid level in this differential is right up to the bottom of that hole, which is okay. It's acceptable. You could top it off if you wanted to, but you don't necessarily need to either. So I'm gonna go ahead and put that plug back in and snug that up, and then I'll show you guys how to check the rear differential. All right, so I'm back here at the rear differential. Coming off the back of that transfer case, there's a drive shaft that goes all the way back to this rear differential, and the differential splits power or torque to both of the rear wheels, and it has its own fluid just like the front differential. So on this particular vehicle, we've got a drain plug there and a fill and a check plug right there. So in order to check that fluid, just like the other differential, I'm gonna go ahead and use my Allen key, put it in there, and I'll probably have to tap on that with a hammer. get it to go in. So now that I got that plug removed, same thing, I'm just gonna dip my finger in there, and there's fluid on the end of there. So that tells me that this differential's full. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the plug back in, and then I'm done checking the fluids on this vehicle. So you always wanna make sure that you use the correct fluids for your vehicle. Look it up, you know, find the right fluids for whatever fluid you have to top off. So that way you know that you're using the right stuff. And if you guys found this video helpful, again, please like and subscribe for more. And go ahead and check out some of my other videos on this car. Like I said, I'm going to do the oil change and also a tire rotation and a brake inspection. Thanks.